Otwituaries. Tiny poetic elegies for the celebrated, the infamous and the obscure. Written and presented by Andy Jackson.
Welcome to the monthly Otwituaries podcast. I've been writing these short tweet-length poems called Otwituaries to celebrate the passing of celebrities both great and obscure since 2012. They try to capture something of that person in up to 280 characters. The only qualification is that the person has to be someone whose contribution to the world has had an influence on me, however minor. There are now over 800 of them. They aren't necessarily great poems, but they do come from the heart. The Otwituaries are published as a kind of instant response. They appear initially on X, what used to be called Twitter, hence the name of this project, on Facebook, and on Instagram, and then are gathered on the Otwituaries blog at otwituaries.blogspot.com. Please do follow them if you enjoy the ones you hear in this podcast. This is the podcast for the month of October 2023. This month we feature another selection of poetic tributes to those who passed away in that month: an undercover war heroine, a versatile American actor, an acerbic cartoonist, and Britain's best-loved footballer. War in the 21st century has become a television event for so many of us. Correspondents reporting from the front line and images which haunt and horrify the viewer. And yet, as with all conflicts, much of the real fighting happens off-camera. War conceals its inner workings, as it arguably always has. The further back you go, the murkier war becomes and the less we know about its true protagonists. The inner histories of World War II were kept secret for many years, and some of its most incredible stories have only been told in relatively recent times. These include the accounts of those who worked undercover, parachuted into occupied countries to coordinate the work of the resistance or to gather intelligence to be transmitted back to the Allied forces. Among these extraordinarily brave and resourceful people were women such as Phyllis Latour, known as Pippa. She worked for the Special Operations Executive in Normandy from 1944 until the end of the war. Of 39 female undercover operatives to work in France during World War II, she was the last survivor, aged 102. I read about Pippa and other SOE heroines in a number of newspaper articles about 20 years ago. It struck me as sad and strange that these people returned to normal life after the war, and how benign the world must have seemed away from the daily threat of discovery or death. Undercover agents were not protected by the Geneva Convention in the way the armed forces were. Spies, if captured, would almost certainly face interrogation, torture, and execution by the Gestapo. Pippa never spoke about her wartime activities to her family, who only found out about them via the internet, probably in the same way that I did. Whether this reluctance to discuss her wartime work was an expression of modesty, a desire to forget the trauma, conflict, or some other reason, I don't know. What I do know is that she and her colleagues were incredibly brave and deserve to be remembered long after others celebrated in these Otwituaries are forgotten. Pippa Latour died October 7th, 2023. Here's to a life in the dark. The sky you fell from, the unlit lanes and assignations under a war-torn moon, the family who never guessed how you set Europe ablaze. When I was a teenager, I tried several times to get into movies under age. Back in the 1970s, there was a different certification system to the one that exists now. There was still a U certificate, but no PG. There was no 15 and 18, but a certificate A, meaning that children could go, but had to be accompanied by an adult. Then there was a double A, specifying that the child had to be over 14 and didn't need a parent usually, and X, for 18s and older. I tried several times to get into double A's without success, but finally managed to look 14 in order to fool the ticket office at the new Princess Cinema in Monton, Manchester, to letting me into the film Sweeney 2. There was no chance of getting into X-rated movies until I was about 16 though, meaning I missed an awful lot of horror movies. One of those was Carrie, the 1976 shocker directed by Brian De Palma, in which Sissy Spacek's psychic adolescent went crazy at school prom and then murdered her domineering and hyper-religious mother, played with genuine deranged menace by American actor Piper Laurie. When I finally saw the movie, some years later, it was these scenes between Piper Laurie and her daughter, Carrie, which disturbed me most. I later saw Piper Laurie in Twin Peaks and Children of a Lesser God, but it was a much more obscure film which sticks in my mind now, a 1979 heartbreaker called Tim, featuring a very young Mel Gibson playing a small-town 20-year-old with learning difficulties who falls in love and marries Piper Laurie's 40-year-old woman next door. The movie ends happily, as I recall, and being a gormless and lonely teenager myself back then, I saw something reassuring in this parable of film which seemed to say that there is someone for everyone. Piper Laurie's sensitive portrayal of the woman who sees beyond the outward demeanour of a man to the kind and trusting person beneath is very different from her shattering role in Carrie, but neither movie would be the same without her. Her role in Tim may be all but forgotten, but her role as Margaret White in Carrie still burns the eyeballs. Piper Laurie died October 14th, 2023. These are godless times. Actors wade through blood for men and their lenses. I came home to a dark house to find you lighting candles to me and my teenage horror. We don't feature many cartoonists in the Otwituaries. I wrote an obituary for Bill Tidy some years ago, he of the Fosdyke saga, but I'm struggling to remember any others that I've written. This set me to wondering why cartoonists are not in the public eye in the way that photographers and artists sometimes are. I grew up with cartoon strips in my dad's Daily Mirror. I formed ideas about working-class marriages in the North by following Andy Capp, and about the secret lives of children in The Perishers. I was fascinated by Frank Bellamy's adventure strip Garth, mostly because it was sci-fi, and because most of the women seemed to go around with no tops on. I was only 12, so please forgive my adolescent unwokeness. The cartoons in Private Eye, a magazine I started to read as a student, were a different species altogether. They were mostly one-off, satirical and political observations, but there were also some long-running strips, one of which was The Yobs, drawn by Blackpool-born cartoonist Tony Husband, which ran for 38 years in Private Eye magazine. The Yobs were a group of violent but irredeemably stupid and thuggish skinheads. They all seemed to look identical to each other, and in the space of 3 simply drawn but hilarious frames, they encapsulated an entire group identity with their own set of behaviours, usually illegal, and patterns of speech. Quite an achievement to keep this going for so many years and keep it fresh. And hilarious. Did I say it was hilarious? Tony Husband drew other strips for other magazines, but it was The Yobs that won him the title Best Strip of the Year at the British Cartoonist Awards in 2000, and it's for that fortnightly chuckle his wit and hand provided, which I will remember him. Tony Husband died October 18th, 2023. The dark ministry wheezes, breathless with mediocrity. The streets are full of yobs, swaggering into conscious print. And yet, one stroke of a pen, and this, all of this, is pricked. Some obituaries are harder to write than others, and it's usually the better-known celebrities with whom I struggle. Some I don't even attempt. What could I have said about the late Queen Elizabeth or Nelson Mandela that hadn't been said in the thousands of columns published in the wake of their deaths? Some lives are too large for 280 characters to encapsulate them, and anything I wrote would almost certainly have been said elsewhere, and far more eloquently. Bobby Charlton was one of those celebrities that you could argue might be in that group. A footballer, yes, but perhaps the best-known footballer ever to come out of the English game, and almost certainly the best loved. He was a World Cup winner with England in 1966, and a European Cup winner in 1968 with a team that I prefer not to mention, being a Manchester City fan. He survived the 1958 Munich air disaster, which occurred a decade before his two greatest successes, and he is generally considered to be one of the most modest and grounded superstars to grace the pitch. He continued to honour the teammates who were tragically killed in 1958 and to support the development of young players at his beloved club. He is described as an ambassador of the game, and he certainly represented the noblest aspects of it. Famous for his driving bursts of pace from midfield and his bludgeoning shots from long range, he was one-third of the legendary United Trinity comprising Charlton, Denis Law and George Best, immortalised in a statue outside Old Trafford. He was no saint, though. His post-retirement foray into club management with Preston North End was not a success, and in later years he became publicly estranged from his brother Jack after a family dispute. But these things only served to underscore a character and career that was largely scandal-free. I was tempted to let my own football preferences override common sense in that I would like to have featured Man City legend Franny Lee, who also died in October, in this podcast. But that would have been a slight against the great Bobby Charlton and his never-to-be-repeated legacy of footballing excellence and human decency. Bobby Charlton died October 21st, 2023. When this world is too full of goal hangers, how much we cherish those who burst from midfield with the ball, a humble juggernaut, a touch, shoot, unlikely, unstoppable. Also in October, we said goodbye, as you've just heard, to the feisty footballer and businessman Franny Lee. Also, British film auteur Terence Davis, actor, impresario and Everton football chairman Bill Kenwright, and the king of blaxploitation movies in his role of Shaft, Richard Roundtree. Check out their Otwituaries at otwituaries.blogspot.com. You can follow the Otwituaries via my Facebook page, Instagram feed, and by using the hashtag Otwituary on X. I'll be back next month with more stories and more poems. Until then, mind how you go.
You've been listening to Otwituaries, a monthly selection of tiny poetic elegies for the celebrated, the infamous and the obscure. Written and presented by Andy Jackson. The music is by Mark Vivian.